Good afternoon. I am Ronaldo McKenzie, and welcome to another episode of the Neoliberal Round podcast. Today, we will be discussing redistributing income to the poor towards sustaining development, social assistance in Jamaica and the United States of America. Again, today, we will be very academic as we will be considering a scholarly paper that was published entitled Redistributing Income to the Poor Towards Sustaining Development, Social Assistance in Jamaica and the United States. It is a paper that was written by yours truly, Ronaldo McKenzie, published on June 30th, 2011, by the University of Pennsylvania. And the paper has since been updated and revised and republished with an extended conclusion as at April 5th, 2022. Now, this paper was part of a thesis written by Ronaldo C. McKenzie in partial fulfillment of my Master of Philosophy in Liberal Arts at the University of Pennsylvania and my Master of Liberal Arts at the University of Pennsylvania, published in 2011, updated with an extended conclusion, April 22. As stated in the abstract, the paper examines how extensive and effective Jamaica's and the United States Social Security program is, particularly social policy on poverty reduction and income inequality. We will explore the program of advancement through health and education path, aimed at providing unemployment cash assistance to the poor and unemployed. This includes making comparisons with similar programs such as TANF in the United States. Uppermost in our consideration is the impact of neoliberal globalization on Jamaica's and vulnerable people's ability to provide welfare to its citizens and or to create a path towards sustainable development, including poverty reduction and increased distributional equity. Further, this paper is published as part of a series of papers that will be presented as Jamaica celebrates 60 years of independence this year. 60 years of independence this year, beginning August 6, 2022. Now, Vice President Kamala Harris and the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Andrew Holness, met recently at the White House in the United States to discuss how the U.S. can continue to support and strengthen Jamaica's goals towards realizing their goals or realizing their efforts of reaching this sustainable development, especially in the area of building their human capacity. So we will begin this particular show by sharing with you the joint press briefing between Prime Minister of Jamaica, the Honorable Andrew Holness, and Vice President, Madame Kamala Harris.
President, good afternoon, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to be hosted here at the White House. My team and I are grateful for the very warm reception we've received. Madam Vice President, from the outset, let me say thank you for the announcements that you have made for support for Jamaica in the areas of commerce, health and COVID-19 recovery, and for us, very importantly, human capital development. And also for the commitment for further strategic dialogue as to how Jamaica and the region on a whole can be supported, particularly in transitioning our democracies into prosperous economies. And that has been the essence of our conversation. Madam Vice President, let me say that you have been a source of inspiration and great pride for many Caribbean people, in particular our young women in the region. And we are indeed seeing an increase in the political participation of young women, and this diversity in the political space will augur well for the region. And I want to congratulate you on your leadership and your accomplishments.
Thank you.
This visit takes place in the context of Jamaica celebrating 60 years of independence and 60 years of diplomatic relations with the United States. The United States was one of the first countries to recognize newly independent Jamaica. And we have had that very strong relationship since. The United States and Jamaica enjoys strong people-to-people economic and development partnerships, and we're very proud of our continued strong relationship. Today, our discussions reaffirmed this strong partnership, and we discuss ways in which this partnership can be strengthened and expanded. Madam Vice President, the Jamaican government and people have sacrificed and worked hard to successfully entrench macroeconomic stability and fiscal sustainability, and in particular in managing our debt. It is a journey on which the United States has been a very good partner through several of your agencies and indeed various multinational multilateral institutions. Jamaica today is a model of a small, open economy which has transitioned its public financial management into a stable and financially prudent one. To secure these gains, we must now turn our attention to addressing the vulnerabilities that have been exposed within the context of a pandemic and other global developments, particularly in relation to energy security. In this regard, growth, infrastructure, human development, national security, and as noted, energy security are areas of priority. We believe these areas also coincide with the United States' interests in ensuring that the region is secure, peaceful, stable, and prosperous. We have presented an overall plan to secure Jamaica's prosperity and growth, and have provided an outline on how our focused partnership with the US can deliver on the promise of the great future that Jamaica envisions, particularly as we herald in our 60th year of independence. In this regard, Jamaica will redouble our efforts in tackling illegal trafficking of weapons and persons, the lottery scam, and other transnational crimes. To address this in a decisive way, we are seeking to foster increased partnerships and collaboration on information and intelligence sharing, extradition, and other law enforcement efforts. On the economic development front, we reiterated that we would welcome refocused attention on Jamaica in areas of security, energy, capacity building, infrastructure, and nearshore digital technology hubs. Madam Vice President, I thank you for your time today, and again, we welcome the announcements you have made in support of Jamaica. Our strong and deep relationship with the United States is built on our shared democratic values and principles. It is an enduring relationship. We look forward to working with you to leverage the strength of our partnerships to enhance the security, peace, well-being, and prosperity of the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister.
Again, that was Prime Minister of Jamaica, the Honorable Andrew Holness, and Vice President of the United States of America, Kamala Harris, who was at the White House recently sharing and having discussions about how the U.S. can continue to support Jamaica towards their sustainable development plans or their sustainable development goal, particularly as it relates to the development of the human capacity. So for those of us who are joining us, just to remind you that today we are discussing redistributing income to the poor towards sustaining development, social assistance in Jamaica and the United States of America. And the paper that we are contending for or that we are exploring, the paper examines how extensive or effective Jamaica's and the United States Social Security program is, particularly social policy on poverty reduction and income inequality or distributional equity. Now, we will explore the program of Advancement Through Health and Education, PATH, which is aimed at providing unemployment cash assistance to the poor and unemployed. This includes making comparisons with similar programs, TANF, in the United States. Uppermost in our consideration is the impact of neoliberal globalization on Jamaica's and vulnerable people's ability, and vulnerable people we're talking about in the world. So the book is not just looking at Jamaica, the book is looking at vulnerable and marginal people and poor people in the world and their ability to provide welfare to themselves or for countries who have this issue to provide welfare to its citizens and or to create a path towards sustainable development, including poverty reduction and increased distributional equity. So the discussions that we're having is broken up into 5 segments here. One is the introduction. The second part is Jamaica's social and economic context, and as we discuss Jamaica's social and economic context, we're talking about the effects of global recession on Jamaica and the US. 1, 2, poverty and income inequality, and 3, the comparative effects of the global recession in the US. The third consideration is the devolution and the evolution of social assistance. And we're looking at the rationale and the evolution of PATH, PATH. And the next segment, section 4, we will look at redistribution outcomes of PATH and TANF. And these will be broken up into some subsections. We will look at benefit target, and under benefit target, we will ask and answer the question, are PATH participants poor? 1. 2, to what extent has PATH reached the poor? 3, how does PATH compare to TANF? And 4, comparisons with other transfer programs. And then we will conclude and we will have 2 conclusions. 1, we will look at how effective is PATH and TANF in targeting the poor. And the second part of the conclusion, we will look at the need for a workable and sustainable development plan. Again, the second part of the conclusion, we are looking at the need for a workable and sustainable development plan. And that's what the discussions will be broken up into those segments today. Now, the presentation will be a very long presentation, very scholarly, very academic, but very relevant. It is not just for scholars, it's not just for academics and university students, but the discussions we're having is for policymakers and every single person in society, because we all have a responsibility to help each other and to ensure as people that the other is taken care of, because no man is an island and no man stands alone. Now, just so you know that this particular presentation or this particular discussion that we're having is a discussion that I started to have in 2011 at the University of Pennsylvania when I was studying income inequality and poverty and also looking at global south, global north. This is part of the discussion that is included in the book that I have published entitled Neoliberalism, Globalization, Income Inequality, Poverty and Resistance, which was published last year, 2021. So this and that book is available via ReinaldoCMcKenzie.com. It's available at theneoliberal.com. It's also available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, Target, and almost every single online platform that sells book that you can think about. So it's also available in audio and in the Kindle. But part of the reason I am having this discussion right now was because I met up with a very important person, a very good friend of mine, who is currently pursuing his Doctor of Philosophy. And I believe that he's having conversations at the University of Maryland, which focuses on sustainable development. But before I had this conversation, which was just 2 or 3 days ago, with Mr. Alvin Bradbury, I just want to give you a little background on Alvin Bradbury. Alvin Bradbury was also what recently just finished some kind of work with the Jamaican government. He was a consultant at the Ministry of Education in Jamaica, looking at issues of sustainable development as it relates to the PATH program. And so he is at a very good place to talk about what's happening in Jamaica. And he's an American citizen, so that studies not just sustainable development within the global south, but what is particularly interested not just in the global south or geographic issues, but we're talking about international global issues. But because sustainable development is not just looking at a particular region, people in the global south, but we are also looking at peoples, marginal and vulnerable peoples in the world. Because if you part of the discussions we're having here that looks at talking about sustainable development and poverty reduction and income inequality, we know that also within the US and within post-industrial countries, there is a large group of the population. There are marginal groups, there are vulnerable peoples in post-industrial countries, in inner city communities, and so on and so forth, that are also affected by not just poverty, but abject poverty and world hunger, and also the issue of equity and fairness and justice. Those are issues that's not just felt within the Caribbean, but people within part of the US, of the United States, peoples within post-industrial countries. There are peoples within these countries who can identify with the very same issues that peoples within the global south are experiencing. So this particular discussion is not just for the Caribbean man or those within the diaspora, but we're talking about Pan-Africa, or people, black and brown people, who are usually affected by issues, the global issues of poverty, abject poverty, world hunger, income inequality, so on and so forth. But of course, part of my study is to go beyond, and part of my study, if you have been listening to my presentations and reading my writings, part of my study looks at the challenge of society today is a challenge whereby we have a tendency to privilege certain positions, and the issue, and we talk about categories and race and so on, which are challenges, because part of the issue that we have is we talk about winners and losers within a competitive world, and then it would seem as if that society has developed race and then chosen a particular race who will now experience poverty or abject poverty and lack in their lives. And we're saying we have to be, in order to deal with or to resolve the challenges that we have to move away from some of these issues. In fact, I posted this article, and we are having an intense discussion on academia.edu. I posted this presentation or this paper within a discussion group on academia.edu, and you can go to my academia.edu at rmckenzie.academia.edu, and you can bring up this particular discussion on redistributing income to the poor, sustaining development, social assistance in Jamaica and the United States of America. So I posted this in a discussion group, and several persons are responding. One particular person, Carolyn Graham, says, "This is an important topic and should add value to policy consideration for such programs. However, it is lengthy for a discussion forum of this nature, and it would have been good if key arguments, findings, and conclusions could be summarized separately to allow persons to more readily raise their views and offer suggestions. So I will agree that the paper is about 36 pages long, but it is broken up into several smaller discussions, and it's a coherent discussion. It's broken up because there is a conclusion that you can refer to, and there is a beginning, but we have, in order to make the bold conclusions that we are making, we have to look at the history. And this particular paper, as I said, started in 2011, but the issues between 2011 to now, they continue. We are still seeing the issues that this paper raised is still an issue that we are continuing to ask ourselves in 2022, especially with recent health-related issues such as COVID and all that has happened in the world. The issue of poverty reduction and the issue of social assist, and not only that, the fact people have certain ideological principles as it relates to social policy, which is not going away. And whoever forms or wins the political forms the power block of the day, give it Democrats or Republicans or PNP or GLP. Some of that is part of the problem, because whoever is in power and the ideological principles that they have will affect whether or not the policy towards sustaining development, which includes a task of reducing poverty and facilitating distributional equity, that task, those issues, or the will, or the challenge for this, of course, it is a political issue, or it becomes a political issue. But the people whose lives are affected by poverty and income inequality, it is not for them a political issue. It is a life issue. And part of the life issue that they are experiencing is a result of political strategy or policy. And as a society, we have a responsibility to respond to these issues. And not only that, there are wider implications and ramifications that we have to grapple with if we do not respond to poverty and to this issue of distributional equity. So I am going to share the interview that I had with Alvin Bradbury, and then after that interview, we are going to begin our introductions and delve into the paper some more. So let's listen to Alvin Bradbury. We'll be right back after this. Welcome to another episode of the Neoliberal Round podcast. I'm speaking with scholar extraordinaire Alvin Bradbury, and he is with us right here live. Now, you were saying, Tim, so he's actually at in Maryland right now at the university, about to have meetings and about to do his PhD. We're not sure if he's accepted yet. But you are sharing with me about what you are doing and so on.
Yeah, so you asked me what was my experience in Jamaica, and while I was there, the primary purpose of why I went at the time, in addition to like visiting family, was also to I accepted a consultant position in the policy and statistical division of the Ministry of Education. But during the same time, I was also carrying out my master's, my second master's, which is Master of Education in International Educational Development at Teachers College, Columbia University. And so I was, the ministry served as a great launch pad for that, because I was interviewing persons there. I was interviewing persons at the Ministry of Labor and Social Security around the PATH program and how the program combined with educational initiatives of the government of Jamaica as a part of its 2030 Vision 2030, which is in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Plan, and particularly Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is centered on education primarily. So that was the cost of my research, and a lot of the interviewees, there was someone from the Inter-American Development Bank, there was someone from UNESCO's Caribbean Cluster Office, which is headquartered in Jamaica, and there was somebody also from who's a Jamaican himself who used to work at the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, but he's currently the social policy officer at UNDP Jamaica. So I was able to get a good mix of policy experts, both doing work in Jamaica as well as those who are on the global level but based in Jamaica. And I got to speak to, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Professor Knut Thompson, who is at the University of the West Indies. He's the...
I've heard that name before, but I'm not familiar. But you said there are two things you said that I want to follow up on. You said that Jamaica's 2030 goal. What is their as it relates to sustainable? What can you just give us a quick public summary, or what is the 2030 goal?
So in the early 2000s, the United Nations launched its Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals were intended to uplift a lot of, allow countries that are considered developing to meet a lot of their benchmarks. And, many of these countries, some made inroads, some didn't, but then as a continuation, are part and parcel a little bit different from the from the Millennium Development Goals. They came up with the Sustainable Development Goals. And one of so goal number 4 is regard to education. So I believe there are 15 goals within the Sustainable Development Goal. And so a lot of countries have aligned their own national plans to strengthen or allow for access to education, for economic development, etc. They have aligned it with the Sustainable Development Goals. So Jamaica's national development, which is spearheaded in part by the Planning Institute of Jamaica, is the Vision 2030. But Vision 2030 is just the overall plan that was launched in alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals, because it's expected that by 2030, many countries that are expected to reach the benchmark would have done so under the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's the benchmark. Realistically, because so many countries are on different levels of development. That's not going to happen. But it serves as a benchmark nonetheless. And I mean, within this, you also have other things like there's the National Education Development Plan. The government of Jamaica has also, if you will, reformed its high school structure by allowing for there to be a mandatory sixth form. So there's a mandatory sixth form, etc.
Okay, and just so you know, what this PASS? I know PASS is an acronym, and just for our listeners, what this PASS stands for?
PASS is the Program for the Advancement. It's a program for the advancement of health.
Okay.
And education. It's a program through the advancement of education, health and education, or something of that. So PASS would be equivalent of the United States public assistance programs. So it's aligned with education in the sense that families that have school-age children have to have them enrolled in school in order to get the minimum benefit of PASS. And then, of course, there are other benefits that families can tap into based on different factors, such as whether or not there is an elderly family member in the household, whether or not there's a woman who's pregnant in the household who's lactating. There are different factors that determine the amount of funding that recipients of PASS receive. But even with that being said, the amount of money, even at its max, that's received in PASS is not nearly as enough that will allow the average family in Jamaica to really sustain themselves, you know? So yeah, that's pretty much what PASS is. And there are other initiatives. There are initiatives to help students who would have graduated high school and, and moved on to university where through PASS or the continuing aspect of PASS, they will get funding, educational funding. They will get a stipend to buy food, that sort of thing. So, but definitely PASS is a social program. It falls under the auspices of the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, even though there's an education component to it, which the ministries collaborate, but it's mostly under Ministry of Labor.
I think I did a paper, and I actually did a paper in academia.edu that compares social assistance in Jamaica and the U.S. I was actually trying to find. I was actually trying to find it, but I couldn't find it. But I did do a paper on that compares social assistance with Jamaica and in the U.S. But social assistance is not. It's still not elaborate. It's still not systematic or structured. There's still lots of room for improvement, and I've argued that.
Well, I mean, the same could be said about the United States. I mean, Jamaica is, the PASS is really meant for a certain population of individuals. It's not everyone qualifies for PASS.
Welcome back to the Neoliberal Round podcast, and today we are having a very serious discussion entitled Redistributing Income to the Poor Towards Sustaining Development, Social Assistance in Jamaica and the United States of America. And of course, we said that the paper is part the paper. The paper is part of the paper examines how extensive and effective Jamaica's and the United States Social Security program is, particularly social policy on poverty reduction. And we said that we will explore the program of advancement through health and education, PATH, P-A-T-H, aimed at providing unemployment cash assistance to the poor and unemployed. This includes making comparisons with similar programs, TANF, in the United States. Uppermost in our consideration is the impact of neoliberal globalization on Jamaica's and vulnerable people's ability to provide welfare to its citizens or to their citizens, and or to create a path towards sustainable development, including poverty reduction and increased distributional equity. So the aim of social assistance is to help the poor cope with the risks of poverty in a global neoliberal society by redistributing the wealth created in the market. The extent of this assistance does not necessarily alleviate poverty or create distributional equity. Jamaica and the United States, former British colonies, have been experimenting with income redistribution through social welfare to reduce poverty and inequality since the British Poor Laws over 200 years ago. Despite consistent reforms to improve these welfare initiatives, poverty and inequality are still at unacceptable levels, especially among the most vulnerable. In 1996, the United States dismantled its AFDC and created a new social assistance program, TANF, to reduce needy families' dependence by forcing them to work albeit low-wage dependent jobs. Similarly, Jamaica reformed its social safety net program by conflating its 45 programs into a new PATH program to provide better coverage and assistance and to empower the poor. Notwithstanding this wave of initiatives, poverty ricocheted to higher levels and is rising, while income distribution is far more unequal. Therefore, this study compares Jamaica's social assistance program, PATH, which is the program for the advancement through health and education, to the United States, TANF, temporary assistance to needy families. This comparison is done by measuring the extent to which these welfare programs redistribute income to alleviate poverty and reduce income inequality. Of course, we have already said from the outset that such programs, by their very definition, are not necessarily designed to prevent or lift people out of poverty, but are merely a coping mechanism to help the poor maintain a minimal or less than basic standard of living. Hence, it will be interesting to ascertain from this research whether this anecdotal observation holds true. The redistributive power transfers in the two countries will be measured by their coverage, size, and absolute incidence and simulated impacts on poverty and inequality, and by their distributable or distributional characteristic. I find that social assistance in these countries can be effective instruments to redistribute income and empower the poor. Yet, they have not managed to do so as effectively due to political reasons based in ideologies, administrative malpractice, and bungling, shortfalls in governmental revenues, and the need for society to retain a set of lumpen proletariats to provide cheap or slave labor. Further, the redistributive impacts from social assistance are more limited and even regressive in the US than Jamaica. This progressivity derives from a design factor which truncates coverage due to requirement of membership in formal labor markets. TANF covers only 40% of eligible poor, which represents a 50% reduction in social assistance coverage since 1996 and excludes 80% of those earning below poverty line. Of course, this is from a study this is from 2011 up to 2011-2012. On the other hand, PATH covers 59.6% of those in the lowest quintiles, up from 30% within the same region or the same period. Nevertheless, it too excludes a large proportion of the most eligible poor, about 40.6%. Hence, the conclusion is that both countries' welfare programs are ineffective in assuaging poverty. Governments should therefore reconsider these programs or at least strengthen their design. However, without international aid, Jamaica's spiraling debt and development levels prevent them from effectively redistributing the wealth, which is scarcely limited. The United States are in a better position to produce the kind of programs that will see marked difference in the standard of living of its poor. But unless a more equitable and just distribution of the wealth is vigorously pursued by US and Jamaica, I'm afraid these programs will continue to meet only the basic or less than basic needs of the poor. Let us now look at Jamaica's social and economic context. Jamaica's social and economic context. Colonialism and neoliberal globalization have severely debilitated Jamaica's ability to effectively maintain a comfortable living standard for the poor. Independence from Britain in 1962 and the end of their relationship with the International Monetary Fund in 1996 have not unhinged Jamaica's dependence on the global north. Jamaica was forced to liberalize and privatize its economy after it could not meet its financial obligations. Beyond the 70s, government continued to play a strong role in providing as far as possible for the welfare of its most vulnerable people. Historically, Jamaica was stratified along racial and class lines stemming from the plantation system. According to Lundy, class structure is characterized by maldistribution of wealth, and there is a correlation between wealth and whiteness. 1999, page 8. That's from Lundy's book. However, this classification grossly underestimates the growing middle class, which grew from 25% in 1961 to 37% in 1991. Hence, class is now based on occupation status as well as race. As Jamaica moved towards political independence in the 1960s, Jamaica experienced significant economic growth. However, those at the bottom quintiles were divorced from this growth as poverty recorded a high of over 30%. This led to massive migration to Europe and North America by the poor, as there were no effective social security programs to ensure against the effects of poverty. Those who remained infected by Cuba's Fidel Castro and the socialist imperatives in the region commandeered a political revolution that birthed Jamaica's social agenda in the 1970s, which gave rise to democratic socialism. Hence, the wealth was redistributed as the government led a social economic policy of distributional equity. The welfare regime transitioned to a conservative corporatist system in the 1950s and 60s to one that resembled more the universal or socio-democratic regime. As a reaction to this ideological move, which also affected the profit margins of the wealthy and democratic dominance in the region, capitalists fled the island. investment and foreign aid from US and the UK dried up. The issue was compounded by the severe oil crisis of the 70s and the neglect of the market and infrastructural development that severely affected government's overall revenues and ability to maintain government spending. So by the 1980s, democratic socialism was abandoned so as to garner international financial assistance to alleviate economic disequilibrium or disequilibria and balance of payments deficits. The government was forced to commodify its welfare system and liberalize its economy through structural adjustment to facilitate neoliberal globalization. However, economic restructuring towards a market economy was slow and haphazard as government continued, though decreasingly, to provide social security. While this restructuring created a burgeoning and active middle class and pushed poverty down, this was on the backs of the poor who had maintained and fallen into abject poverty. Further, unemployment and overall standard of living worsened among rural residents, whose farming goods couldn't compete with cheaper imported products, experienced declines in their industry, and migrated to urban areas in unsavory living conditions. So that by the 1990s, informal employment and underground economy of drugs and gang violence provided these best alternative means. Again, by the 1990s, informal employment and the underground economy of drugs and gang violence provided the best alternative means or the best alternatives of survival within a policy that was increasingly neglecting the poor. This placed tremendous burden on the community and the family, which lacked the access to maintain a basic and comfortable standard of living. Dons are called, and when we talk about dons in Jamaica, we're talking about area leaders and criminal kingpins. Dons provided the social safety net in communities that were largely neglected by a weakened state that was becoming less involved given global pressures to liberalize and marketize. And we played the Prime Minister just now, talking with the Vice President of the US, Vice President Harris, about the issue of security, not just energy security, but the issue of dealing with crime and violence, which is a major issue in Jamaica, because as I said to you, this underbelly, the neoliberal globalization weakened the capacity of the Jamaican government and the global South peoples to effectively provide for their people, especially the poorest peoples in society. So what has happened is that who facilitate this lack? The kingpins, the area dons, and so on, who at one time were in bed, or there was a love affair between the political leaders in Jamaica, and also because they also were being funded by these kingpins. So, of course, the Prime Minister of Jamaica and the governments in these countries are moving away from their reliance and their associations with kingpins and area dons. So as a result, as Jamaicans become more independent, as Jamaica become more prosperous, and as Jamaicans have the ability to provide a social safety net for its people, then of course, Jamaica becomes much more stable. Jamaica no longer will rely on the criminal element or an underground economy that facilitates and breeds crime and violence. So that is why it is important that countries understand the importance of maintaining an effective social safety net. So we said that dons and area leaders and criminal kingpins provided the social safety net in communities that were largely neglected by a weakened state that was becoming less involved given global pressures to liberalize and to marketize. The family, church, and community groups, aided by international donor agencies, picked up the lax by the state, thereby playing an integral role in mitigating the social link or the social risks in the Jamaican society, so that the experience of risks have not been as traumatizing and mutilating. In fact, one writer asserted that many Jamaicans who live in poverty and are vulnerable to risks are ignorant of this, given this strong support network. However, Jamaica's standard of living amongst the poor remains a sore issue, which provided an impetus to the Jamaican government to reform and improve its welfare program to expand its coverage and reach to the poor. So, what is the effect, or what are the effects of global recession on Jamaica and the US? What are the effects of global recession on Jamaica and the US? During most of the 1990s, the Jamaican economy Welcome back to the Neoliberal Round podcast, and we are having a discussion entitled Redistributing Income to the Poor Towards Sustaining Development, Social Assistance in Jamaica and the United States. And of course, we said that the paper is published. This paper is published as part of a series of paper that will be presented as Jamaica celebrates 60 years of independence this year, beginning August 6, 2022. And of course, we said that Jamaica has is part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal Plan to realize a goal, a set of sustainable goals, which involves the building of their human capital by 2030. And so we were looking at Jamaica's context, and we asked the question for the next subtopic that we are now going to be considering is, what are the effects of global recession on Jamaica, but not just Jamaica, the US? And we said that we started by saying that during most of the 1990s, the Jamaican economy experienced low or negative growth, and that in 1996, a crisis in the financial sector exacerbated matters when the solvency of several insurance companies and other domestic financial institutions emerged as an issue. While Jamaica has made remarkable progress in some social sectors, for example, in 1990, poverty rate decreased from 28% in 1990 to 17% in 1999, the upward trend in some social indicators is likely to be temporary unless the economy improves. That is what I had said. While doing this paper in 2010 to 2011. And that is what I had said. And as I continue to read, as I continue to share my findings and I share my presentation with you, as I continue to share this, you will see the pattern and what I'm talking about. And because here is it that we're saying that the upward trend in some social indicators are likely to be temporary unless the economy improves. So we are setting goals to reduce poverty and for there to be more, and to improve this distributional equity. But you're seeing, we are already saying that there are upward indicators. But we are saying, and we are predicting that we're saying that these upward trends will be short-lived and are transient. They are short-lived because unless the economy improves. But this is likely an insurmountable task, this improving the economy. It's an insurmountable task given the effect of globalization and the recession on the Jamaican economy. This resulted in significant job losses, salary cuts, rising inflation, devaluation in the Jamaican dollar against the US dollar, rising unemployment, and massive reduction in main income-generating sectors, remittances, tourism, bauxite, and agriculture, which adversely affected government spending and their ability to grow the economy and effectively redistribute the wealth to the poor. This is not now. We're talking about some time ago, but it seems as if we're talking about today. When you study the global south or countries' small state situation, it is, whether you study it 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or today, it is as if you are met with, or you're experiencing deja vu. You are reading the same thing and the same story. Because it's as if as soon as there are some gains, the gains disappear. So we're here saying that this resulted in significant job losses, salary cuts, rising inflation, devaluation in the Jamaican dollar against the US dollar, rising unemployment, and massive reduction in main income generating sectors, remittances, tourism, bauxite, agriculture. And all of this affected government spending and their ability to grow the economy and to effectively redistribute the wealth to the poor. In addition, focus group research conducted in Jamaica by the World Bank in 1999 found significant decreases in the well-being of the poorest individuals over the last 10 years, and in rural areas, an emerging category of severely poor households, often including the elderly. And this is from the World Bank in 2001, page 6. However, unemployment has declined from 15% in 1990 to 10.6% in 2008. This decrease is partly due to the growth of the informal sector from an estimated 28% of GDP in 1989 to an estimated 43% in 2001. Probably one of several contributors to a significant reduction in poverty levels. But this is unlikely to be sustained as middle class income has declined due to higher levels of inflation and a flat growth rate, coupled with a reliance on imports, particularly oil, food, and consumer goods. This makes the Jamaican economy acutely vulnerable to exogenous shocks. In light of this situation, the challenge for the government of Jamaica was to prevent a reversal in the significant declines in poverty witnessed in the 1990s and to ensure that the poor were adequately protected. But let us look closely at the nature of poverty and inequality in Jamaica, the nature of poverty and inequality in Jamaica and the US. Poverty and inequality in Jamaica. In fact, exacerbated by the global recession, a major force behind the development of PATH is the nature of poverty in Jamaica and its relationship to education and healthcare, for instance. Poverty is concentrated among the young and the old, with almost half of the poor younger than 18 years of age and another 10% over age 65. Secondly, and of course this is according to a World Bank report of 2001. Secondly, in rural areas, with nearly 80% of the poor living in rural areas and less than 10% living in the Kingston metropolitan area, the World Bank, and that's according to the World Bank in 1999. thirdly, among female-headed households, with 66% of poor households headed by women, although women head only 44% of all households. And fourthly, among larger families with 40% of poor families consisting of 6 or more members. Jamaica, in addition, I must add that Jamaica comparatively, Jamaica's comparatively favorable social indicators that we have just presented mask a significant lack of access to education, especially among the poor. Although poor children are typically enrolled in school, they sometimes do not attend regularly. Poor families tend to attribute erratic attendance to money problems, and it's not just, and by the way, and this is not just the global South or Jamaica issue, but if you are to study and to do an anthropological study or study of poor communities or marginal communities within the US, you'll find the same thing. You'll find the same comments, and you come to the same conclusions. Poor families tend to attribute erratic attendance to schools based on money problems. Indeed, the World Bank found that a lack of money has prevented parents from sending their children to school and providing them with food, clothing, and shelter. Poverty is related not only to education, but also to the quality of and access to healthcare. Also, poverty poses a barrier to healthcare, especially in rural areas. Moreover, from 1971 to 1993, the top 20% experienced a sharp fall in their incomes, while the bottom income groups all had increases in their income. The coefficient, the Gini coefficient, which measures income inequality, fell from 0.53 to 0.362, which suggests that Jamaica had greater equality as the government of Jamaica maintained relatively strong state intervention. However, due to the acceleration of neoliberalism in the decades of the 1990s and 2000s, marked by greater financial deregulation and market reform, the economy underwent a financial collapse and an economic recession that disproportionately affected the poor and working class. Hence, the poor and working class experienced a sharp fall in their incomes, while the incomes of the richest remained the same or increased, thereby pushing the PR ratio from 42.6% to 53.5%. Now, what is the comparative effect of the global recession on the US? We just looked at Jamaica. What about the comparative effect of the global recession on the US? On the other hand, the United States, unlike Jamaica, is highly diversified and developed with annual per capita incomes and domestic production that more than quadruple Jamaica's rates. Yet, globalization and the current recession have produced similar hardships among their most vulnerable peoples, with rising poverty and extremely high unemployment. The current global recession followed a disappointing economic recovery that started at the end of 2001 and culminated in 2010. That recovery marked the first time on record that poverty and the incomes of typical working age households in America worsened despite 6 years of economic growth. The share of Americans in poverty climbed from 11.7% in 2001 to 15.7% in 2010, and median households income declined 3.6%, reaching its lowest point since 1997. The recession has been characterized, the recession in the global recession, and we're talking about the previous global recession, between 2008 up to 2010, 11, so on. We're saying that the recession has been characterized not only by high levels of unemployment in the US, but also by the speed at which the ranks of the unemployed swelled. Between the start of the recession in December 2007 and January 2010, the unemployment rate more than doubled from 4.9% to 9.7%. And this particular study is a bit dated, but it is not. It provides history, it provides lesson, it provides a lesson for us as we seek to move towards poverty reduction and to improve levels of income inequality through education and health care and so on, and providing distributional equity. When you look at where we are now and why we are where we are now, we will have to look at what have we done in the past. What have we done? When you look at the global recession has created and several challenges, health-related challenges, world crisis, conflicts, all of these affect the poor and vulnerable people in society. So that despite the advances and the gains, they are easily wiped away. We will continue with these discussions in the next topic when we talk about the devolution and evolution of social assistance. Welcome back to the Neoliberal Round podcast. We are talking about redistributing income to the poor. Again, we are talking about redistributing income to the poor towards sustaining development, social assistance in Jamaica and the United States of America. And now we will be moving on to the next subtopic, looking at the devolution and evolution of social assistance. We begin with the rationale and evolutionary development of PATH. The rationale and evolutionary development of PATH, P-A-T-H. Program through the advancement of health and education. Before the development of PATH in 2001, the government of Jamaica since the mid-1930s provided minimally for the poor. However, since Jamaica's independence in 1962, the government of Jamaica financed 45 safety net programs through 12 ministries and Department of Government. However, the effectiveness of these programs was perceived to be low. For instance, the World Bank recently found that the majority of these programs do not adequately serve the poor. And that's usually the case. Not just in poor countries, but not just in post-industrial countries, but both post-industrial countries and developing countries. That's always the case. That majority of the programs do not adequately serve the poor. And of course, for poorer countries, or global south countries, they themselves are poor. And we had said earlier that in order for them to help the most vulnerable in their society, they need aid as well in order to do so. In addition, other programs are not designed to target the poor at all, as is the case for most of the labor market programs. In 2001, PATH was created as a means-tested program designed to replace three major income support programs that provided cash for in-kind assistance: the Food Stamps Program, the Poor Relief Program, and the Public Assistance Program. Again, the Food Stamps Program, the Poor Relief Program, and the Public Assistance Program to the poor. This reflected a new approach that combines or combs social assistance with the accumulation of human capital, which underscored a movement towards defamiliarization and further decommodification of the welfare system. The PATH program is funded in part by the World Bank and the government of Jamaica, who also administers and monitors the program through its Ministry of Labor and Social Security. The program is intended to fight poverty in the present through monetary transfers and to reduce poverty in the future by encouraging poor households to invest in the health and education for their children or of their children. Now, PATH identifies poor households through a scoring formula that ranks households from poorest to best off. Households scoring below a predetermined threshold level are eligible for program benefits. PATH is organized around two components. Firstly, child assistance grants, which provide health and education grants for eligible poor children through age 17. The average monthly benefit per child receiving a health or education grant in 2005 was about $6.50, which is only 20% of the minimum standard of living, not barely enough to survive. Secondly, social assistance grants to adults that provide grants to poor pregnant or lactating mothers, elderly poor over age 65, and poor, disabled, and destitute adults under the age of 65. Initially, the receipt of benefits was conditioned on adults making regular health clinic visits. However, this changed shortly after the program was launched, and benefits for adults are no longer conditional. Similarly, in the United States, Congress created TANF as a means-tested, federally funded, state-administered safety net program to help support low-income individuals and families to meet their basic needs. Some cannot or could not find employment. Others can only find part-time work or earn wages far below what they can or what they need to cover their basic expenses. Still, others are facing short or long-term personal or family challenges that makes work or steady work unfeasible. In 1996, TANF replaced the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC program, which provided monthly cash grants to families with children. A key feature of TANF is that it is a fixed block grant that is provided to the states, which then have broad flexibility to decide what benefits to offer and under what conditions. Consistent with the 4 TANF purposes set out in the law. Now, states have a maintenance of effort, MOE, requirement that compels them to continue to spend at least 75% of the funds they were spending in their AFDC and related work programs as of 1994 on one of the TANF purposes. Over time, states have spent a declining share of their TANF block grant and MOE funds on basic monthly cash assistance for families in need. In fiscal year 2008, they spent only 30% of their $30 billion in TANF and MOE dollars for this purpose. States used the remaining funds to provide childcare, other work support and employment programs, transportation, and other services to families with children. Typically, TANF programs provide a monthly cash grant on an electronic benefit card to program participants, most of whom are required to participate in select work activities as a condition of initially receiving or continuing to receive cash assistance, which, like Jamaica, covers only 20% of the minimum needed to meet the basic standard of living. But this new approach characterizes Americans' conservative ideology, which promotes a new Protestant ethic of individualism, self-interest, and neoliberalism. Traditionally, the US has loathed big government and any kind of social problem that involves socialism. Poverty and inequality is an individualistic individual's responsibility. I apologize. Poverty and inequality is an individual's responsibility or an individualistic responsibility stemming from the blame, the victim mentality. Hence, the profits are privatized and risks are socialized, with a decommodified political welfare regime that promotes and protects capitalist wealth and at the expense of external risks borne by the losses or by the losers. Therefore, over time, TANF has served a decreasing share of eligible families. In 1995, AFDC served 84% of all eligible families. In 2005, TANF served only 40% of all eligible families. As a result, TANF has become less effective over time at reducing deep poverty, defined as having family income below 50% of the poverty line. We will see this clearly when we examine the redistribution outcome of TANF in the next chapter. So we will move from this now to talk about redistribution outcomes of PATH and TANF. And we will start by looking at benefit targeting. Are PATH participants poor? That's the first question. And the answer to that? Most PATH participants are poor. Most PATH participants are poor. About 3 of every 5 PATH participants have consumption levels below the poverty line. By contrast, the overall poverty rate in Jamaica at the beginning of the program was about 20%, 1 of 5. About 4 of every 5 PATH participants fall into the bottom 2 quintiles of the consumption distribution. We will continue this discussion after these messages. Welcome back to the Neoliberal Round podcast. Today, we are presenting a scholarly and academic paper that was published in 2011 and revised yesterday, 2022, by the Neoliberal Corporation, entitled Redistributing Income to the Poor, moving towards sustainable development. Moving towards sustainable development. Social assistance in Jamaica and the United States of America. Again, redistributing income to the poor towards sustaining development, social assistance in Jamaica and the United States of America. And we're looking at 2 programs, targeted programs for the poor, as we explore the issue of sustainable development, the United Nations 2030 goal. We're looking at TANF and PATH, which are 2 social assistance or welfare programs. And we said just before we had the break that we will be discussing the devolution. Sorry, not the devolution of social assistance. Yes, the devolution of social assistance. And we said that the rationale and we're looking at we just discussed the devolution of social assistance actually, and now we're looking at redistribution outcomes of PATH and TANF, and we're looking, and the first thing we're going to look at is benefit targeting. Are the participants poor? That's the first question we need as we explore this redistribution outcomes of PATH and TANF. Benefit targeting. The first question that one must ask as we delve into this particular aspect is, are the participants really poor? And the answer is that most PATH participants are poor. Yes, they are poor. About 3 of every 5 PATH participants have consumption levels below the poverty line. By contrast, the overall poverty rate in Jamaica at the beginning of the program, PATH program, when it started, was about 20%, 1 of 5. About 4 of every 5 PATH participants fall into the bottom 2 quintiles of the consumption distribution, which means they are among the lowest 40% of Jamaican households in terms of adult equivalent consumption levels. Now, among those participants who are poor, about half are in particularly dire circumstances. About 1 of every 4 participants is in extreme poverty, which implies that while most participants are poor or close to being poor, a small fraction of PATH participants seem to be relatively well off. About 6% of households fall into the top 2 quintiles of the consumption distribution. And about 17% of PATH participants have consumption levels greater than 1.5 times the poverty line. And about 6% have levels greater than twice the poverty line. Therefore, PATH has been relatively successful at targeting its benefits to the island's poorest households. Specifically, 59.6% of benefits were found to go to the poorest quintile of the population. However, this excludes 40% of the poorest. Comparisons made to TANF in the US suggests that this figure compares favorably with results that have been attained elsewhere. The next question is, as we look at redistribution outcomes of PATH and TANF and explore benefit targeting, the next question one must ask as we arrive at an answer is, to what extent has PATH reached the poor? To what extent has PATH reached the poor? It is useful to assess the extent to which PATH was able to reach poor households in Jamaica by comparing its coverage and reach to other social programs in Jamaica and the US. An indicator often used to quantify coverage is the coverage rate. Now, the percentage of poor Jamaican households served by PATH. In 2002, the overall estimated poverty rate in Jamaica was about 20%. With Jamaica's population at approximately 2.6 million, the total number of Jamaicans living in poverty is about 520,000. Now, as noted earlier, the current number of beneficiaries receiving PATH benefits in a typical period is approximately 180,000, and 59% of these enrollees are poor. Thus, PATH is currently reaching approximately 106,000 poor beneficiaries. Overall, therefore, the program's coverage rate is approximately 20%. 106,000 over 520,000 we're talking about. Moreover, poverty grew to a total of 445,500. That's 16.5%. And the assistance from government grew by 60% during the period, so that 70%, 315,000 of the persons in poverty received assistance. This, therefore, represents an increase in benefit targeting. In addition, PATH has been effective at accomplishing its objective of encouraging households to send their children to school with greater regularity. PATH has also been successful in meeting its objectives of increasing the use of preventive health care for children in PATH families. While PATH has been successful at increasing school attendance and preventive health visits, there is no evidence that it was able to affect long-term outcomes such as grades, advancement to next grade, or healthcare status. There are problems with implementation, and the targeting of benefits may still be improved. However, as persons who were not deserving received PATH benefits, while certain other households were turned down by PATH, even though their need for assistance seemed very great. Moreover, the coverage is still limited and excludes a large portion of the population who are poor. Again, while PATH has been successful at achieving or increasing school attendance and preventive health visits, there is no evidence that it was able to affect long-term outcomes such as grades, advancement to the next grade, or healthcare status. We say that there are problems with implementation, and targeting of benefits may be improved, because there are persons who were not deserving of the benefits who received it, and there are those who were deserving of the benefits who were turned down. So this affects and this creates some problems for benefit targeting. What about comparisons with other transfer programs in Jamaica? Now, relative to other social programs in Jamaica, PATH's targeting performance seems to be good. In particular, PATH has achieved much better targeting than food stamps. One of the main programs for which it was to provide a substitute. About 59% of PATH beneficiaries fall into the bottom quintile, as compared with 36% of food stamp participants. Now, and in addition, about 4 of every 5 PATH beneficiaries fall into the bottom 2 quintiles of the consumption distribution, as compared with only about 3 in 5 food stamp participants. In addition, 6% of PATH beneficiaries fall into the top 2 quintiles, as compared with 18% of food stamp participants. So overall, PATH seems to be doing a much better job in targeting the poor than food stamps. In targeting the poor, PATH also seemed to be doing as well as or better than other Jamaican assistance programs. Now, how does PATH compare with TANF? The effectiveness of PATH in redistributing the wealth must also be compared against TANF's overall coverage and target. In addition, it is interesting to ascertain how TANF performs in comparison with other welfare programs in the US, such as the food stamps program. As noted earlier, PATH is more effective in targeting the poor and covers more poor people, but this is not the case in the US with TANF. Unlike food stamps, which are available to nearly all low-income individuals, only families with children are eligible for TANF benefits. In 1995, AFDC lifted 2.2 million children out of deep poverty. In 2005, TANF lifted only 650,000 children out of poverty. Fewer than food stamps and other means-tested benefits. Still, TANF remains an important component of the safety net, as it is one of the few programs that provide cash assistance to non-working families to help them meet their basic expenses. And just so you know, as we're talking about TANF, which now targets families with children. So we're talking so individuals and young people without children are left behind. And recently, the Department of Human Services in the US, and I would work with the Department of Human Services for years in this country, looking at ways we can going into communities and developing plans and exploring benefits that families could access. But one of the recently, I think it was late last year, we know that there is a housing crisis in Philadelphia where many young people, there is a lack access to housing. A lot of young people today in Philadelphia, and I think there was a call by the commission and several persons within Philadelphia encouraging people to provide housing and access to housing and provide more programs so that especially young people can access housing, because many of these young people don't have families and many of the social benefits are tied to being or having a family. So then what you are having is that these programs are created to aid poor people, but they are tied to certain requirements, and so more young people, as young people become younger adults, now they are left with less access because they are no longer part of a family and they themselves do not have family. So what must these young people do? Of course, some people, of course, go and have a family and start a family without any means to taking care of their family in order to pass the requirement to access benefits, which I believe, and of course this is from 2012 and 13 we're talking about. Okay, when you look at the history of the programs and when you start to consider why they do not work, and what we can do today to mitigate some of these challenges. The next topic is for discussion is TANF cash assistance program have responded evenly. So we're still looking at how does PATH compare with TANF. We're still looking at that. And so the next topic for discussion is TANF cash assistance programs have responded unevenly. That is the answer. We said in most states, TANF, in addition to the fact that we are saying that compared to the AFDC program, which lifted 2.2 million in 1995, lifted 2.2 million children out of deep poverty. In 2005, TANF only lifted 650,000. In addition to that, TANF cash assistance programs have responded unevenly. So that in most cases, TANF cash assistance programs have lagged far behind the food stamp program in their responsiveness to the recession and rising poverty, and when compared to the Jamaica's food stamps program matched against their PATH program. Nationally, the total number of families with children receiving cash assistance has increased by just 10% since the beginning of the recession. We're talking about the recession, the 2000 and we're talking about the recession that started in 2008, 2009, and that went way beyond 2010 into 2012 and 13. So as in most states, TANF cash assistance program have lagged far behind the food stamp program in their responsiveness to the recession and rising poverty. Nationally, the total number of families with children receiving cash assistance has increased by just 10% since the beginning of the recession. Since TANF's creation, states have focused on reducing their TANF caseloads for a variety of reasons: fiscal, ideological, and as a public measure of effective performance. And even during the current economic downturn, they have been slow to shift away from this emphasis. Many states have policies and procedures in place that make it difficult both for eligible applicants to obtain benefits and for recipients to continue receiving benefits even if they remain eligible. Some states require applicants to participate in work activities for a period of time before they can qualify for aid. But some families may be in crisis and have difficulty meeting these requirements until they begin to receive help in meeting basic needs. States have continued to impose these work requirements even during the economic downturn, and even up to today, 2022. Many states have eased their enrollment processes for food stamps and Medicaid, but have not extended these improvements to TANF. Others continue to actively discourage TANF applicants, and in some cases, families in need may not pursue TANF because of stigma, erroneous information about eligibility, time limits, or other reasons. So now this brings us to the conclusion. And there are two conclusions here. Having said all what we have said, how effective is PATH and TANF in targeting the poor? And secondly, the second part of the conclusion, the first part of the conclusion, was already part of the paper that we had published in 2011, or part of the research between 2010 and 2012, with some updated figures in 2018. But so part A will consider the challenge or the barriers or how effective these programs were, so that we can think about them now and where we are now. Are we still experiencing those challenges? How have we addressed those challenges? And the second part of the consideration that we want to consider, the second part of the consideration that we want to consider here when we look at the conclusion, is the need for a workable and sustainable development plan. And I deliberately chose that topic or that title. It's a play upon words, because here we are talking about sustainable development and the United Nations SDG 2030 goal, which started between 2015 and 2030. The goal is no reduction. There are 10 goals. But what we are saying, when we look at the data and the conversations we're having, the conclusion that I am presenting is one. I will present a conclusion that speaks to the effective or the efficacy of PATH and TANF in targeting the poor. And the second part, which is fresh and new and the recent addition to the conversation, is the need for a workable and sustainable development plan. When we come back, we will conclude with the discussions that we are contending for today by lifting up one, how effective is PATH and TANF in targeting the poor. Then we will take a break, and then we come back and look at the need for a workable and sustainable development plan. Continue to listen to the Neoliberal Round podcast as we discuss redistributing income to the poor towards a sustainable development plan, comparing TANF with PATH, Jamaica and the US. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to another episode of the Neoliberal Round podcast. We are discussing redistributing income to the poor towards sustainable development, comparing TANF with PATH, social assistance in Jamaica and the United States. And we are now at the conclusion as we wrap up the discussion. The first part of our conclusion, we will look at how effective is PATH and TANF in targeting the poor. So how effective is PATH and TANF in redistributing the wealth to the poor so as to assist them in coping with this uneven global economy that has largely excluded them? And which is more effective at targeting the poor? What lessons can both countries learn to properly treat the problem of poverty and income inequality? We have argued throughout this paper that poverty and income inequality exists and are worsening in spite of these programs. Reforms in Jamaica have widened the social safety net to catch the poor and ameliorate the risks. But still, the efforts are insignificant as the assistance is a far cry from what is necessary to meet the poor's basic and minimum standard of living. But when compared to the US TANF program, Jamaica seems to be way ahead, disadvantaged only by their slow economic growth and dependence on foreign aid. But notice I say seems to be way ahead, but they are not. way ahead in reality, because you will hear me say, and at an interview I just conducted at the Germantown radio station, and if you read the book Neoliberalism, Globalization, Income Inequality, Poverty and Resistance, we talk about a bucolic society. Jamaica had a bucolic society. You will never know people who are poor. You don't know who the poor people are sometimes. The study to, or the data to capture the poor people, or the people who are in need. You don't know that sometimes, because the society does not do a very good job in capturing or understanding this issue of poverty. Because for some people, the way life is lived or set up is not as elaborate, systematic within these global south countries. And many of them have informal arrangements that helps to deal with the issue of poverty and income inequality. So the next question, so we said that Jamaica seems to be way ahead, but only in theory. The US has reformed its social assistance program, and part of the problem is an ideological problem. Part of the problem is a political issue. And not only that, please remember that Jamaica's context and the global south context, Jamaica in itself is a dependent country. The country as a whole is poor. Jamaica as a whole is a dependent capitalist country with some amount of wealth or some amount of revenue that's generated on the island. But that's the point here. So the US has reformed its but part of the problem is that US has reformed its social assistance program, which has effectively ended social welfare and its means-tested work requirement. Again, we said that Jamaica seems to be way ahead, but we said only in theory. And part of the problem why Jamaica seems to be way ahead is the ideological issue, and not only that, or the kind and the fact, the kind of country that the context, economic context here. The US has, and not only that, the US has reformed its social assistance program, which has effectively ended social welfare and its means-tested work requirement, makes poor people vulnerable to slave and cheap labor. Jamaica has relaxed its means test and conditional requirements, making it easier for the most eligible to benefit from the program. But just we know that we said earlier that there are some Jamaicans who benefit who don't need to benefit, and there are Jamaicans who need to benefit but they are not benefiting. So that's also part of the problem. Okay, but we said Jamaica has relaxed its means test and conditional requirements, making it easy for the most eligible to benefit from the program. This attitude stems from a political climate that underscores an integrated and social approach to living. However, the US is highly liberal and individualistic and opposes socialism. The risks are socialized minimally and individualized optimally. This exposes the vulnerability to wage-dependent labor, which propagates a cycle of poverty and inequality within the US. America should learn from some of the global south countries or from Jamaica, but more so from the Scandinavian countries that are highly decommodified and are benefiting from a surplus, high employment, skilled labor, high wages, and growth that such a regime brings. These countries have effectively redistributed the wealth so that there is very little poverty and income inequality. Now, Jamaica is aiming to do so, just that. But it's limited by its low levels of development and pressure from the neoliberals to reduce government intervention in the market so that they can continue to profit from the openness and the desperate group all too willing to work at or for anything. We're talking about, and this is a conclusion I came to when I submitted this particular paper, and it's also part of a wider discussion I'm having on neoliberalism, globalization, income inequality, poverty, and resistance. Indeed, poverty and income inequality have increased despite these welfare schemes. So none. So here is the point. Here is the most important point here. Here is the conclusion, or part of the conclusion, as it relates to the efficacy. Poverty and income inequality have increased despite these welfare schemes. So none is very effective in redistributing the wealth to the poor. So poverty and income inequality is a roller coaster. It's a roller coaster in these countries. So, in one sense, you see poverty increasing and income inequality and and distributional equity and improvement in distributional equity. But in another sense, then shortly after, poverty is increasing, inequality is also increasing. So of course, there is this steady movement towards a particular goal. You will never get there, because that is the reality. When you study the global south, global north dynamics and vulnerable people, and you look at it, and if you begin and you look at my book, I start from 1492 all the way up to now, and you see the mixed results and the fluctuations in the results, up and down. So there's no real progress. There's no real progress because of the fluctuations. So we're saying that Jamaica, though, is aiming to do what the Scandinavian countries are doing. But poverty and income inequality have increased despite these welfare schemes. So none is very effective in redistributing wealth to the poor. But the US is in a better position to do so because of its level of development and economic prowess. Yet, TANF, unlike PATH, is a social assistance program that lacks the human capital component that is necessary to empower the poor marketability. Jamaica's PATH program is aiming to improve the living standards of the poor through increasing their human capital. This is a best practice which may be applied to the TANF program that has a maintenance of effort. Jamaica's program is almost more effective, but their openness, dependence, and debt make it difficult to provide universal coverage or to improve the programs. They have benefited tremendously from foreign aid, which bore at least 50% of the cost of providing welfare. So their ability to provide for the welfare of their citizens or those who are needing of welfare is also dependent on outside or external, where their ability to also to be provided for, because Jamaica as a whole is they are dealing with poverty within their own country, but the country as a whole also is a poor. So on the global scale, these countries also need some kind of welfare or aid program, which I believe IMF, the World Bank, IMDb, the Structural Adjustment Policies, USAID, so on. These programs were created by the United Nations and developed countries, post-industrial countries, as a welfare scheme in a sense. So even on the global level, these countries are part of a global welfare program, and then within these countries, they are also now have to deal with the issue of their own peoples being poverty and experiencing abject or some amount of poverty. And of course, in order for them to fix the problem or provide the welfare for the most needy, of course they need outside help. And we are here saying that 50% of the cost of providing welfare in Jamaica is borne by foreign aid. So without this foreign aid, they are unable to deal with these, to provide for their citizenry. Nevertheless, social assistance in these countries can be effective instruments to redistribute income and empower the poor. Yet frequently, they have not managed to do so as effectively and efficiently as possible. TANF's program has served a decreasing share of eligible families, and both TANF and PATH coverage rate excludes a significant number of poor people. On the other hand, Jamaica's PATH program, which started in 2001, has not only served an increasing number of poor families, but helped to augment its human capital, as the program, unlike the US, does not have a work requirement, but an education and health requirement. Hence, both Jamaica and the US welfare social assistance program are ineffective in curbing or alleviating poverty. Governments should therefore reconsider these programs, or at least strengthen their design. They could also look to targeting mechanisms that have impressive rewards wherever this is found. But unless a more equitable and just distribution of the wealth is vigorously pursued, I'm afraid these programs will continue to meet only the basic or less than basic needs of the poor. Finally, and when I said finally, I'm not talking about finally, the final point, but still dealing with part A of our conclusion. At the end of the day, Smith asserted that the most critical driver of poverty reduction is whether Caribbean countries create the conditions for producing relatively sound and sustainable economic growth going forward. Specifically to Jamaica, I think a big part of the problem has to do with the fact that for the last 30 years, it has significantly underperformed in terms of economic growth. So it has been difficult for it to be able to make the type of dramatic reductions in poverty that are required for social peace and stability. The pattern suggests that poverty could take years to start falling and even longer to return to its pre-recession levels. This means that many families will need access to a safety net for many years to come. While not perfect, the food stamp program has demonstrated its ability to respond quickly to changing economic circumstances. TANF has not. For a growing number of families, food stamps provide the only steady source of assistance to meet their basic needs. Food stamps cannot, however, pay the rent or utilities, or pay for transportation to look for work, or obtain needed medical care. The current recession has both highlighted the strengths and exposed critical weaknesses in the safety net. Federal and state policymakers should take what we have learned, therefore, and begin to retool TANF and various other programs now, both to better address current needs and to prepare for the future that lies ahead. Unless Jamaica's debt to GDP is significantly reduced, freeing up additional funds to further develop and grow its infrastructure, then the problem of poverty will continue. However, international aid and debt forgiveness has been pouring in, and Jamaica is poised to becoming a developed country by 2030 and has achieved a number of its development goals. But this, please remember, I wrote this in 2013 or 14. That has changed given COVID and several other things that's happening in the world. And we already talk about the roller coaster ride. So while we say that they are poised, this is not necessarily the case, because as I said to you, their progress or economic outlook is one that is challenged by this roller coaster ride, and their vulnerability is still not properly addressed. So the government of Jamaica, in collaboration with the private sector and civil society, has prepared a long-term national development plan, Vision 2030 Jamaica. The plan envisages Jamaica reaching developed country status by 2030. It introduces a new paradigm, redefining the strategic direction. The old paradigm for generating prosperity was focused on exploiting the lower forms of capital, sun, sea, sand, and tourism, and exporting subsoil assets and basic agricultural commodities. These basic factors cannot create the levels of prosperity required for sustained economic and social development. These basic factors cannot create the levels of prosperity required for sustained economic and social development. The new route is the development of the country's higher forms of capital, the cultural, human, knowledge, and institutional capital stocks, coupled with the reduction of inequality, which will move the society to higher stages of development. That's part A of our conclusion. When we return, we will consider part B, which is the need for a workable and sustainable development plan. Because part B will speak to our conclusion of part A, where we talk about this 2030 vision, which is also part of the United Nations Sustainable Development Plan. So Jamaica is part of the United Nations SDG, Sustainable Development Plan, so that by 2030 they achieved certain goals. So, but based on all that we have said, the conclusion is that there is a need for a workable and sustainable development plan. When we return, we will conclude with this. Continue to listen to the Neoliberal Round as we delve into this very important issue of society. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to the Neoliberal Round podcast. We are talking about redistributing income to the poor, moving towards sustainable development, comparing social assistance in the US and Jamaica. We're here talking about comparing TANF and PATH. And we just concluded the first part of our conclusion, and now the final part of the discussion and the final part of our discussions and the final part of our conclusion, part B, the need for a workable and sustainable development plan. Neoliberal globalization has created income disparities within and across countries and regions, and deepen the realities of poverty for marginalized and vulnerable peoples in the world. Poverty and income inequality are acceptable, but up to a certain point, according to the United Nations and many economists. Because poverty and inequality can cripple societies and create unwanted immigration as people flee to other countries. It also creates chronic crime and violence, poverty and deep inequality, crime and violence, which studies have correlated with poverty and income disparities. Almost all countries and peoples who experience poverty and are at the bottom end of globalization are dealing with crime and violence, hunger, and poor health. Communities such as Kensington, Philadelphia, North Philadelphia, Detroit, Haiti, Jamaica, etc. These places have one thing that is common: more black and brown peoples or poor peoples with low educational outcomes, poor health rates, and income disparities, so that these places are experiencing higher levels of crime and violence and higher health-related issues compared to other places and peoples. Therefore, the UN has created a plan towards facilitating sustainable development within and across countries, and has set goals that is hinged on 10 benchmarks based on the national and international needs and position of nations and peoples around the world. Sustainable development recognizes that this can only be achieved by addressing global challenges in each country today, so as to preserve and position the future to continue to do so tomorrow. It is a type of structural adjustment, but it was supposed to be more humane and contextual, speaking to the social and or human. For it is by building the human will society have the capabilities to utilize the capacities to effect change or to realize some goals. These goals. The issues most important were poverty, inequality, climate change, and environmental degradation, peace, and justice. Structural adjustment wasn't effective because it was more top-down and made these developing global south countries or marginal peoples more dependent and vulnerable to exogenous shocks. So while the UN, through its sustainable goals, aimed to sustain development by empowering nations and peoples, its other agencies, such as the IMF and the World Bank and the IADB, in the Inter-America Development Bank, were working against that with structural adjustment policies that eventually deepened these countries' dependence and exacerbated their debt. But with this new understanding, the UN has a new thrust, which is to engage the local, so that there is a broad-based approach to sustainability or sustainable development rather than top-down. Nevertheless, the United Nations have set certain benchmark goals which they hope to achieve by 2030. These include the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are 1. No poverty. 2. Zero hunger. 3. Good health and well-being. 4. Quality education. 5. Gender equality. 6. Clean water and sanitation. 7. Affordable and clean energy. 8. Decent work and economic growth. 9. Industry, innovation, and infrastructure. 10. Reduced inequality. 11. Sustainable cities and communities. 12. Responsible consumption and production. 13. Climate action. 14. Life below water. 15. Life on land. 16. Peace, justice, and strong institutions. And finally, 17. Partnerships for the goals. Partnerships for the goals. How effective is the UN's SDG program? How realistic are these 17 goals? How and what are the barriers? And here when we think about COVID, international or global competition, the structural adjustment policies, and also natural disasters. So this question is relevant when we just listed the 17 United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. We just listed 17 of them. And the question is, how effective is the UN's SDG program and how realistic, given certain barriers of COVID, the competition, structural adjustment, natural disasters, and so on and so forth. What are we doing to overcome those barriers? strengthening social welfare policies and programs. This is where TANF and PATH supposed to do the work. This is where TANF and PATH comes in. That's what they were supposed to do. And policies were supposed to continue to evolve that would strengthen these programs to meet the changing economic situations in society and the world. In 2008 to 2012, we had the financial and housing crisis in the USA that not only affected the US, but people in the global south who rely on remittances and aid from the US. Moreover, hurricanes, natural disasters, and the COVID pandemic severely hampered the Caribbean and rolled back years of progress. And you can see my book, Neoliberalism, Globalization, Income Inequality, Poverty and Resistance, where I flesh that out some more. The problem for vulnerable peoples and countries is their inability to maintain steady and upward growth. Again, the problem for vulnerable peoples and countries is that there is their inability to maintain steady and upward growth. And over the last several years, their GDP, Jamaica's gross domestic product, has been unsteadied and uneven, and these peoples and those in the global south or those who live in inner cities in the US constantly rely on aid. Further, many global south countries and peoples living in vulnerable and marginal communities are not as diversified in their economic activities, only relying on tourism or certain revenue streams to generate revenues. Therefore, they may benefit from exploring ways to diversify their economy so that they can develop specializations and advantages in more than one or two goods and or services, while strengthening their social welfare programs to increase their human capacity to meet the growing diversity and productivity. I'm gonna say that again, which is very important, because I said some time ago that our leaders are weak, need, and lack vision, and they are not students of history. And we don't learn from past mistakes, but we keep doing the same thing and getting the same results. But yet we want to achieve these. We want to get to a certain level by 2030. But the very same thing that we are trying to rise above or to surmount keeps holding vulnerable peoples back. And I'm saying here that, moreover, hurricanes, natural disasters, and COVID pandemic severely hampered the Caribbean and rolled back years of progress, and that is always going to be the case. So the problem for vulnerable peoples and countries is their inability then to maintain steady and upward mobility. Over the last several years, their GDP, their gross domestic product, has been unsteadied and uneven, and these peoples constantly rely on aid. Further, many global south countries and people living in vulnerable and marginal communities are not as diversified in their economic activities, only relying on tourism or certain revenue streams to generate revenues. Therefore, they may benefit from exploring ways to diversify their economy so that they can develop specializations and advantages in more than one or two goods or services, while strengthening their social welfare programs to increase their human capacity to meet the growing diversity and productivity. What is social welfare in sustainable development? What is social welfare in sustainable development? Social welfare is one aspect of achieving sustainable development. Sustainable development is about strengthening a nation's capacity to reach an acceptable level of development where that country can become interdependent and having an ability to provide for itself and citizens while meaningfully engaging and benefiting from international partnerships and trade. We had stated in previous chapters that Jamaica, for example, has developed a PATH program, And the aim of this program, like other social programs, aimed at alleviating poverty and enabling the capacities of peoples within its country that have limited resources and whose human capabilities can affect the overall sustainable development of a country in realizing self-sufficiency and interdependence. Similarly, in post-industrial or developed countries, there are programs to help the poor and vulnerable. The Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF, program, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, TANF, provides states and territories with flexibility in operating programs designed to help low-income families with children achieve economic self-sufficiency. States use TANF to fund monthly cash assistance payments to low-income families with children, as well as a wide range of service. In order to get access to these programs, affected families with school-age children must meet certain requirements which have been developed in ideologies that are political instead of applying human sensitivities. In order to access these benefits, families must enroll their school-age children in school, which is then used to determine benefits. In addition, there are work requirements, and at one time TANF was a benefit, or the amount that each family or person received, that only certain unions or couples could access, as it was tied to ideas about religion, faith, and politics. It was the belief that social assistance encouraged poor people who benefited from social welfare and cash assistance to stay home and not work. But studies show that poor people want to work, but the jobs that are available to them are low-wage jobs that no one in society wants to do. And for these people, they would rather live on welfare and take on ad hoc informal jobs so as to survive, meaningfully survive. Because what TANF or PATH provides is barely enough to move people out of a cycle of poverty. Further, I interviewed a consultant who has worked with Jamaica and the UN and UNDP and UNESCO, studying the PATH program and exploring ways to improve the program while addressing barriers to realizing the UN 2030 SDG goals. And according to Mr. Bradbury, and I played the interview I had with him earlier. According to Mr. Bradbury, PATH at its max is nearly not enough to allow any family to sustain themselves in Jamaica, let alone develop themselves. It only maintains a level of poverty and dependency then. It only maintains a level of poverty and dependency. On the issue of realizing the SDG goal of no poverty, the paper I presented analyzing and comparing social assistance with Jamaica and the USA suggested that poverty has been declining steadily since 2012. But since 2017, with COVID, poverty has risen and 10% of the world's population live in poverty and struggle to meet basic needs such as health, education, and access to water and sanitation. And we said extreme poverty remains prevalent in low-income countries, particularly those affected by conflict and political upheaval. As it relates to income inequality, in 2015, more than half of the world's 736 million people living in extreme poverty lived in sub-Saharan Africa. Without a significant shift in social policy, extreme poverty will dramatically increase by 2030. In 73 countries during the end of 2012 to 2017, the bottom 40% of the population saw its incomes grow. Still, in all countries with data, the bottom 40% of the population received less than 25% of the overall income or consumption. Further, incomes may have risen, but this does not take into account inflation, rising prices, and fall in interest rates. housing prices, and other factors that affect incomes and its value. So incomes may have risen, but the standards of living have also risen. And I shouldn't say the standards. The cost of living have also risen. So social welfare becomes very important in society to minimize this. But the desire and will to implement policies that effectively redistribute wealth and incomes, and or to provide better services, benefits, and adequate access to certain resources, then again, but the desire and will to implement policies that effectively redistribute wealth and incomes and or provide better services, benefits, and adequate access to certain resources will not work. No UN goal will work. In fact, poverty and inequality have never been stable for those who are its main citizens. Poverty and income levels or income levels are fluid. It's never constant. So it would take bold steps and efforts, which is not possible given human greed. The rich continue to get rich at the expense of the working class, and social welfare is seen as suspicious. While we seek to develop how many are willing to now compete with another country. While we seek to develop, many countries are more in a competitive drive. One must reconcile this competitive drive as well. 2030, this 2030 goal is unreachable when countries are seeking economic dominance and competitive advantage over others. So the UN Sustainable Development is a theoretical idea that is being exercised in futility and is antithetical to competition. In fact, sustainable development is not new. This started in 1987 from a report adopted from Scandinavia that recognizes the importance of building human capabilities and capacities so that we can respond to the challenges of tomorrow, which the report suggests is climate change. If we can't deal with the issues of today and position the future for tomorrow, there will be no tomorrow. There will not be a tomorrow. So over the past years, there have been efforts to develop plans to explore and implement programs that empower the human. But the results are not that positive, given several world-related health issues such as COVID, capitalist greed, and unfair trading practices that have all played a role in slowing any efforts for sustainable development across countries. Again, I will end by saying this, that there will not be a tomorrow. There will not be a tomorrow if we can't deal with the issue of today and position the future for tomorrow. So over the years, there have been efforts to develop plans to explore and implement programs that empower the human. But the results are not that positive, given several world-related health issues such as COVID, capitalist greed, and unfair trading practices. They have all played a role in slowing any efforts for sustainable development across countries. Thank you for listening to the Neoliberal Round podcast. And just so you know that this paper is available at theneoliberal.com in the post, which is entitled Towards a Caribbean Perspective, or Towards a Journal for Caribbean Perspective. This paper is also available, and there's an active discussion that's going on rmckenzie.academia.edu. You can participate in this discussion there. We've also added several references and resources and endnotes that you can peruse for further readings. If you go to these websites, ReinaldoCMckenzie.com to access it, or you could go to theneoliberal.com. And if you want to participate in the discussion, you can go straight to my website, theneoliberal.com, or you could go to rmckenzie.academia.edu, and you can participate in the live discussions there. I've also posted links to the discussions on my Twitter feed, Reinaldo McKenzie, and also links to the feed via my Facebook page, Ronaldo.McKenzie, and also links to my LinkedIn, Reverend Ronaldo.C.McKenzie. Thank you so much for listening. And if you would like to support the program, please, if you are listening to this broadcast, at the end of, if you go to the details, you will notice something that says support or donate to the show. I invite you to do so because all of our resources and materials are free except the book and the audio book and the book. You can purchase that on our website by going to the RonaldoCMcKenzie.com and going to our store, or you can actually purchase the books at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or if you would like several copies for your students or for your bookstores, you could go to Ingram's Park and make purchases through there, or you could, of course, contact me here at the Neoliberal Corporation. Thank you so much, and please stay tuned for several new materials and resources and projects that we are working on. Of course, we're working on a new book project. It's called Privilege, Power, Position, Status, and Secrets to Unlocking Divine Intervention. Thank you so much for tuning in. Share this podcast with your friends and join us for the next explosive podcast, which we already have 2 podcast episodes lined up for you. One I did earlier that asked the question about Black Lives Matter. It says, corruption within Black Lives Matter and resistance movements. Are they closer to achieving their aims? Again, the next podcast episode, we will be discussing corruption within Black Lives Matter and resistance movements. Are they closer to achieving their aims? Thank you for listening. Take care and have a great day.